Shalom and hi, my name is Al and welcome to our 8th video continuing with the exposure, the enemy exposed. As we discussed in our last video, Bereshit 2 or Genesis 2, the man and the woman were created. Spiritually, Bereshit or Genesis 1:26 says, in the image of the Almighty, and he's not flesh and blood. Okay, Bereshit 2, made from the heavens and earth. Formed from what was made. Placed in a garden, in Eden, rivers, trees, beasts, and animals. And they had one rule, the man and woman, one rule. One law, do not eat from the tree of knowledge, for in that day you will surely die. Now beginning with the real topic of this presentation in part 8, exposure. The enemy exposed. Bereshit 3:1. Now the serpent was more subtle than any beast of the field that Yahweh had made. Serpent, let's take a look at this word first so we can see what it's talking about. In the Hebrew, it's pronounced nakash, and it's our spermacite here. It is the wall, and then it is the teeth. So, of course, the sperm carries the distinction of life and action. And then we have the wall, a separation. And then finally we have the teeth, which teeth devour. So what would be the meaning of the serpent but that the teeth that devour the wall of life? The serpent devours O-U-R-S, life. A very apt description of what a serpent does. However, it's more to it than that, because it says the serpent was more subtle than any beast of the field. And the next word we want to take into consideration is then. And it sounds funny, but it's deeper than you think for here. Now let's go to Merriam-Webster and see what they have to say.
Definition of then. First, used as a function word to indicate the second member or the member taken as the point of departure in a comparison. B, used as a function word to indicate difference of kind, manner, or identity.
Thereby we see that the word then, we see that the serpent indeed is not just some dumb beast of the field. To shed more light on this and where this is all going, our next chapter and verse is Ezekiel 4:4. In order to understand the fullness of the enemy and the exposure, we are now going to Ezekiel, the Old Covenant prophet, who was way down here about 600 BCE, before the Common Era, and he was living in Babylon. You see, Ezekiel and his friends Daniel made Aliyah, or a trip to Babylon, because they made him a deal he couldn't refuse. And he was an exile living in Babylon, in this plush, opulent, central, governmental edifice in the Middle East that all cultures bowed to at this particular time. Babylon was the big boy on the block. So we have Ezekiel. His name in English, of course, doesn't mean very much, but in the Hebrew, it's quite profound. This is the modern Hebrew, and when we break it down, we get the Yud, Hey, and we have a different letter here now. This is actually a Z sound, a Yez Hekel, and it carries with it the message that Yah's salvation. Yah's salvation. Well, we have already seen this again and again, that the Father has his great I am in the beginning of a lot of these names. But I would like to suggest this, my Israeli friends, that there's also a Zion in this, which carries the meaning of not only tool, but weapon. And at the end, we've got the Almighty. So we can say that Yah's salvation is actually Yah's salvation of the Almighty through his weapon, which is going to be Ezekiel. Ezekiel has a tremendous story because as a prophet, he was despised. He spent 390 days laying naked on his left side in the midst of Babylon. In the midst of this Wall Street consumer society, this man is naked, laying on the ground, and people walking by him. He's not participating in the system, and they think he is mad. His commission from the Father of this salvation is he shall bear the sin of Israel for 390 days, which is 390 years. Israel was the 10 tribes that were carried away over here somewhere about 720 BCE. They were carried away, they're gone. And he is now bearing their sins. And after he has finished doing the 390 days, the Father says to him, lie now on your right side, and you shall bear the sin of Judah. 40 days for 40 years. He, together, when we put this together, comes out to 430 days, 430 years. And if we were to go to Shemot or Exodus, way over here, the time of Moses, when Moses takes the Israelites out of Egypt, somewhere around 1500, he tells them, you were in Egypt for 430 years. It's repeating itself here, is it not? Now this man had a hard time, not only being despised and being naked, but he was expected to bake his bread on dried human dung. He pleaded with the Father, and the Father said, okay, I like you. I'll let you use cow dung instead. So he bore the sins of Israel and Judah for 430 days. Let me ask you this, my Jewish friends. Would your rabbi do that for you? You see, the Father uses what is despised in the world to bring us into a revelation. And a lot of times, we don't want to see it or accept it, like at the time of Ezekiel, as everybody thought he was mad. Okay, that said, let's continue.
Ezekiel 28, verse 12. Son of man, take up your lamentation upon the king of Tyre, and say unto him, thus says Yahweh Elohim, the Almighty, thou sealest up the sum, full of wisdom and perfect in beauty. Thou hast been in Eden, the garden of the Almighty. Every precious stone was thy covering, sardius, topaz, diamond, beryl, onyx, jasper, sapphire, emerald, carbuncle, and gold. The workmanship of thy tabrets and thy pipes were prepared in thee in the day that thou wast created. Thou art the anointed cherub that covereth, and have I set thee so. Thou wast upon the holy mountain of the Almighty. Thou wast walked up and down in the midst of the stones of fire. Thou wast perfect in thy ways from the day that thou wast created, until iniquity, sin, was found in thee. By thy multitude of thy merchandise they have filled the midst of thee with violence, and thou hast sinned. Therefore I cast thee profane thing out of the mountain of the Almighty, and I will destroy you, O covering cherub, from the midst of the stones of fire. Thy heart was lifted up because of thy beauty. Thou hast corrupted thy wisdom by reason of thy brightness. And I will cast thee to the ground, and I will slay thee before kings, and they may behold thee. First thing that needs to be said is that we need to notice that the king of Tyre certainly wasn't in the midst of the stones of fire. He wasn't created at the beginning, so it can't be the king of Tyre. However, what the Father is using here is the king of Tyre, this small Phoenician island off the coast of Lebanon, just north of Israel, because, like Babylon, it was a very wealthy province. Indeed, Israel, from the time of King David, when he first united it, would come in contact with the Phoenicians, but not in a warring manner, in a friendly manner. For the original king of Tyre, Hiram, will approach David and said, "Hey, you're a king too. By the way, you're not living in such a great, grandiose house. Let me build one for you. How about a stone house?" And because the Israelites were largely nomadic shepherds, they didn't have much experience building, cutting stone. And now they're living in Jerusalem, so surely the king needs a nice house. So Hiram says, "Well, I will send down my workmen and we'll build you a house." And so the house is built. And if you know where the city of David is, it's kind of sloping a lot. And as the king's house was higher in elevation than most of the rest of the city, as he's lounging on his porch one day, looking down upon his citizens, he happens to see a beautifully naked woman. And now we get into the story of Bathsheba, which will cause David to sin. Solomon later on, with the Phoenicians, will unite Israel with them, and together they will travel the Mediterranean and seek out gold and plunder. And every year they would return to Solomon the profits of this, something like 666 talents of gold. Thereby, what we are seeing in this is the king of Tyre, of Phoenicia. There's 3 islands altogether, Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos. And they represent a more advanced society, everything that the Israelis would like, kind of like America. It's a little bit easier going, but a lot of things to glean from. And because they were outside of Israel, even though they were pagans, it would be all right to trade with them. But what we're going to see in this is a tremendous contamination through Hiram and the Phoenician culture into Israel for the next several hundred years. Isaiah 14:12, King James reads, "How thou hast fallen from heaven, O Lucifer." In the Hebrew, for Lucifer, it says Helel ben Shekar, or the shining, the son of the dawn. Other translations have it as morning star. How art thou cut down to the ground? which didst weaken the nations, for thou hast said in thy heart, I will ascend into heaven. I will exalt my throne above the stars of the Almighty. I will sit upon the mount of the congregation of the sides of the north. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will be like the Most High. Yet thou shalt be brought down to hell, the sides of the pit. Okay, so now everybody knows who is the serpent. Lucifer, O-Day Star, the dragon, and many more names he has, but all from Bereshit 3, very chapter 3:1, from there on. Bereshit 3:1, King James, Now the serpent was more subtle than any of the beasts of the field which Yahweh the Almighty had made. And he said unto the woman, Yea, has the Almighty said, You shall not eat of every tree of the garden? And the woman said unto the serpent, We may eat of the fruit of the trees of the garden, but of the fruit of the tree which is in the midst of the garden, the Almighty has said, You shall not eat it, neither shall you touch it, lest you die. And the serpent said unto the woman, You shall not surely die, for the Almighty knows that in the day you eat thereof, then your eyes shall be opened, and you shall be as gods, Elohim, knowing good and evil. And when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was pleasant to the eyes, a tree to be desired, to make one wise, she took of the fruit thereof, and did eat, and gave also to her husband with her, and he did eat. And the eyes of them both were open, and they knew that they were naked. And they sewed fig leaves together, and made themselves aprons. And they heard the voice of Yahweh Almighty walking in the garden in the cool of the day. And Adam and his wife hid themselves from the presence of Yahweh the Almighty amongst the trees of the garden. And Yahweh the Almighty called unto Adam and said unto him, Where art thou? And he said, I have heard thy voice in the garden, and I was afraid, because I was naked, and I hid myself. And he said, Who told thee that you were naked? Hast thou eaten of the tree wherein I commanded thee that thou shouldest not eat? And the man said, The woman thou gavest to me to be with me, she gave me of the tree, and I did eat. And Yahweh the Almighty said to the woman, What is this that you have done? The woman said, The serpent beguiled me, and I did eat.
Bereshit 3:13, And the woman said, The serpent beguiled me, and I did eat. Thereby, what has to follow? Judgment? Not quite yet. To really understand the fullness of this, we have to go back to the very beginning of the presentation. We got to go back to Bereshit. In the beginning. And we have our word here, Bereshit. Bereshit. In the beginning. And what we have already seen is, as this is the creation, much more than just a little house, this is the Father's Son, this is the Father, the Almighty, this is the serpent, which we know as Satan, and through these two signs we get salvation. We pick it up again in reading it. Bereshit 1:1. In the beginning created the Almighty the heavens, the earth, And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of the Almighty moved upon the face of the waters. First of all, there's a difference between verse 1 and verse 2. When the Father creates anything, it's perfect. That's without saying. But something has taken place between verse 1 and verse 2, and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was on the face of the deep. Then, and the Spirit of the Almighty moved upon the face of the waters. And the Almighty said, "Let there be light," and there was light. Now we open to our book of Matthew in the New Covenant, and we pick it up in chapter 3, verse 16, and it says, "And Jesus, Yeshua, when he was baptized, went up straightway out of the water, and lo, the heavens were opened to him, and he saw the Spirit of the Almighty descending like a dove and lightning upon him. And lo, a voice from heaven saying, 'This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased.'" And as we recalled previously from Ezekiel 28 and Isaiah 14, they both talked about the enemy, Satan, referred to in Ezekiel as O Day Star. Isaiah calls him Lucifer, which we interpret as O Day Star. And with this, we find out that he is called the anointed cherub that covereth. Now, in the Hebrew, this word cherub is like this. That's actually our K, okay? And here's our little man, and our Vav, cherub, and the B, or the house. And the English translation on this is very uncertain. However, this carries with it the sign of the palm of the hand. Palm of your hand. And it means thereby you can do things with your hand. So you must have the option to do this, to move it. And the resh here would be the sum of, and then this is our nail, which connects. And then we have the house. The house. So putting this together, you're capable of doing something at the highest level within your environment. And it's in this respect that Satan takes this opportunity, this freedom within the house of the Father, and he actually rebels against him. He rebels against him as he wants to be as the Most High. He wants to set his throne above the stars of the heaven. And because he's only a created being within the Father's house to begin with, in the beginning, the Father is having to deal with a rebellion within his house. It's almost like your son that you've lost control of wrecks his room and runs out of the house. What are you going to do? You're the father, you're sitting back, and you're wondering what's happening. Well, in my own case, I can recall many times my mother would be screaming at me as I left the house after I beat up my little sister, screaming, "Wait till your father comes home." And believe me, this sent chills through me. So it's in this respect that the Father is coming, and with the Father is coming judgment. I can remember one time I was so bad that I took my father's boat and I ran away with my best friend to an island off the coast of where I was living. My mother knew about this. She called up the local police and she said, "My son took my husband's boat and went out to this island." And you know what the police said to her? Said to her, "Lady, if you can't take care of your kids, how do you expect us to do it?" And later on, when I got the car keys to my father, and used to like to go around driving around drunk with my friends and smashing his car up, the final judgment was, "You're irresponsible, buy your own car." And when I started buying my own car, that's when I became responsible. So we're at the phase right now where the Father is coming, judgment is coming, and that is the first prophecy, and it's playing itself out in chapter 2 and 3. So follow me there. And the judgment of the serpent is, verse 15, "And I will put enmity," hatred, "between thee and the woman, between thy seed and her seed. It shall bruise thy head, and thou shalt bruise his heel." This is going to turn out to be one of the most profoundest statements in all of the scriptures, but we'll get into this a little bit more deeply later on. For now, the final outcome is the serpent is sentenced to crawl on his belly and eat dust the rest of his life. The man is now to work by the sweat of his brow, and a lot of you men know what that's all about. And women are to bear children in pain. Just a big difference from how children are made, or is it not? But the thing that I want to point out to you is that the judgment we have heard again and again was, "The day that you eat of the fruit of the tree of knowledge, you will die. That very day you shall surely die." However, I also cited to you earlier a scripture in the New Covenant in 2 Peter chapter 3 verse 8, where Peter states emphatically, "Brethren, understand this one fact, that with the Father, one day equals 1,000 years, and 1,000 years equal one day." And we're going to find out that Adam and Eve are going on to produce many sons, and Adam himself is going to live to be 930 years old. And the question is, how can that be? And the only answer is, he lived one day. That same day he ate of the fruit of knowledge, he died. But that one day is 1,000 years. Yahweh the Almighty is Spirit. Bereshit 1:2 and John 4:24. Thereby, when the Father, in Bereshit 1:27, the Almighty created man in his own image. His own image, which is spirit. Thereby, when man and woman were kicked out of the garden at the end of chapter 3, what they lost was spirit. Because we're going to find out that they lived to be 930 years old, but what were they at that time? And what were their children? Their children were only made, formed, and what did they do? They breathed. And your last breath is your last. And this is their immediate judgment from listening to the serpent, because it was a lie and they did indeed die, whether they lived to be 930 years or 1,000 years. The bottom line is they died because they did not listen to the Father's commandments. And we're going to find out that this is going to be man's struggle right down to when Yeshua tells us in Matthew 24, just before he comes back in these very days, and his first admonition in all of the chapter is, do not be deceived. Following the timeline, we see after chapter 3, man's fall. And though man still, after the fall, lived, breathes 930 years, he will die. What do you think happened to the serpent? To find this out, we progress down the timeline somewhere about 1,000 years plus, maybe much more, and we come to the book of Job, pronounced in Hebrew, Eob, pronounced Eob, and know my yeshiva friends, he's not just some pagan Arab in the desert. He's actually a righteous man, and his name in the English translation is persecution, and the man certainly went through a lot, but it's a great teaching aid in the sense of how the enemy works. And what we're going to find here in the book of Job, chapter 1, verse 6, and it says this, and now there was a day when the sons of the Almighty came to present themselves before Yahweh, and Satan came also among them. So, here the serpent is still quite with us. He is referred to as a son, and if he's a son, he is in the creation. And if he is a son of the Father, then it's more than that. He is a created being. He is a spiritual being as well. So let's track the enemy along the timeline and see where and what is the significance of this for us today. Continuing with the presentation, exposure, the enemy exposed, we see well after Job in Chronicles 21, at the time of King David, chapter 21, verse 1, we read, and Satan stood up against Israel and provoked David to number Israel. This is a sin because David was expected to rely upon Yahweh for everything. And it's in this respect that because of this sin, 70,000 Israelis will lose their lives because of David's mistake. I want you Israelis to notice that in that chapter, Satan is actually spelled Satan. We have the teeth, of course, the shin. We have a letter we haven't seen yet for you English speakers. It's called a tet, and it carries with it the meaning of snake and to surround. And of course we have our spermacite, which is about life. So what's the message? The teeth surround and devour the life, exactly what the serpent does, and he has a name, and that name is Satan, particularly from here onward. Tracking the story, even more vividly, we open to the New Testament, the New Covenant, and we see in chapter 4 of Luke, verse 5, Yeshua just finished his 40-day fast, and the enemy has come to him to tempt him as well. And it says, and the devil, taking him up into a high mountain, showed him all the kingdoms of the world in a moment of time. And the devil said to him, all this power will I give thee, and the glory of them. For this is delivered unto me, and to whomever I will give it. If thou therefore will worship me, all of this shall be thine. Well, since the man and woman were kicked out of the garden, they couldn't manage that. They're now in the bigger creation, and they have no spirit. They only have breath life. And when that last breath is gone, they're dead. But we see that the enemy, the serpent, which isn't a serpent, is still very active. And he is progressing down the timeline with the creation of man. To see this more vividly, what his point of view is, we open up to Paul's great book of Ephesians, chapter 6, verse 10, and we get some more information. Finally, brethren, be strong in Yeshua and in the power of his might. Put on the whole armor of the Almighty, that you may be able to stand against the wiles of the devil. For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against rulers of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places. And last night was Trump's second State of the Union address to the world. We pick it up in Revelations, the final Revelation, chapter 12, and it states in verse 3, and there appeared another wonder in heaven, and behold, a great red dragon, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and 7 crowns upon his heads, and his tail drew a third part of the stars of heaven, and did cast them to the earth, and the dragon stood before the woman. The dragon. A third part of the stars were drawn down to earth when? From the very rebellion way back here. Bereshit, in the Father's house. Satan took a third of the angels with him, and as he is cast out of the garden, so is his angels. Or instead of being angels, today they are demons. Yes, they're demons. And it states in verse 9 of 12, and the great dragon was cast out, that old serpent called the devil and Satan, which deceiveth the whole world, and cast them to the earth, and his angels with him. Well, when does that take place? It takes place just about now. It's 2019, and we're getting close to the last days and this. Because as the Father has his people, the enemy has his. Yah is going to have his sons, Seth, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Yeshua, and the enemy is going to have his. And all who follow him gets everything. The money, the women, the power. Did you see the State of the Union last night? What did the biggest part of the budget go to? National defense. And guess what? No one's complaining about that, Democrats or Republicans. Again, as the Father has his, the enemy has his. Okay, we've seen that Satan got David to number Israel He sinned, 70,000 Israelis perished because of his sin. Men, kings, queens, presidents, no Holy Spirit people who are ruling this world that we live in like big armies. They like big navies. They like national defense budgets. And what does this equal? The same thing. Sin, and that equals death. Exactly what the original lie was. You shall eat of the tree of knowledge and you shall not die. That was a lie from way back here. To put this whole thing together, we have to measure it, and we can only measure it by, you shall know them by their fruit. Yeshua, Mashiach, said this in Matthew 7:16. Which brings me to the timeline. Here's where we are now. This guy is coming. Can't be stopped. Has to come. It's part of the Father's plan. So what's to be done? And the answer is, follow us in our next video, which is the seed of the woman. Video 9.